What if I told you that long before the skyscrapers of Riyadh and the oil that reshaped world politics, Arabia was already a crossroads of history? Long before glass towers and highways, it was home to civilizations that carved cities out of stone, built bustling trade routes that connected empires, and left behind monuments that still whisper their stories across the desert winds. Yet, for many, Arabia is imagined only as an empty expanse of sand, a blank canvas waiting for Islam to arrive. What they don't realize is that the land held thousands of years of human triumphs and struggles, of settlers who tamed the harsh landscape, of merchants who carried spices, incense, and ideas across continents, of kingdoms that rose and fell long before oil made the region a global force. This is the story of Saudi Arabia, not as you've been told it, but as history remembers it. If we go back far enough in time, the Arabian Peninsula looked nothing like what we recognize today. Instead of stretching sands and dry valleys, large portions were covered with grasslands fed by rivers and lakes. The region's climate supported herds of animals we do not usually associate with Arabia at all. Fossilized remains show elephants once roamed here, as did hippos, lions, and even species of wild cattle. These landscapes were not barren deserts, but settings where life flourished in abundance. And for early humans leaving Africa, this environment offered both water and food, two resources that determined the path of migration. Archaeologists now believe that one of the earliest major migrations of Homo sapiens out of Africa passed directly through Arabia more than 120,000 years ago. This made the peninsula not just a passageway, but a vital crossroads of human history. Stone tools scattered across ancient dried-up lakes speak to the presence of bands of hunters who once camped here. These tools were not isolated finds either. Evidence stretches from the Red Sea coast all the way to the Thamud desert, telling us that Arabia was not bypassed. It was part of humanity's journey out into the wider Old World. One of the most striking discoveries came when scientists unearthed footprints fossilized in the mud of an ancient lakebed in northwestern Saudi Arabia. Preserved for over 120,000 years, they represent the oldest direct evidence of Homo sapiens in the Arabian Peninsula. To put that into perspective, those impressions in stone were made over 100,000 years before the construction of the Egyptian pyramids. Their existence moves Arabia from the margins of prehistory to the center of early human exploration. The people who left those prints shared their environment with animals long vanished from the region. Picture a small group approaching a watering hole, finding tracks left not only by other humans, but also camels, gazelle, and even elephants. Rock art etched on canyon walls later echoes this lost world, carved figures of animals that once grazed freely across green savannas. For scientists, these depictions confirm the idea that Arabia was far richer and more hospitable than its appearance in modern times suggests. But this period of abundance did not last forever. Shifts in the Earth's climate gradually transformed the peninsula. As rainfall decreased and lakes dried up, grasslands disappeared and sands advanced. Communities that might once have thrived near permanent water sources now faced harsher conditions year after year. Adapting to this changing landscape meant mobility became crucial. Instead of living in fixed settlements, people had to move continually, searching for wells, seasonal pastures, and safe routes through vast deserts. This constant need to roam shaped patterns of life that would echo down the centuries, giving rise to nomadic traditions so widely linked with Arabian identity. The idea that Arabia was simply a passageway between Africa and Eurasia is being challenged by new findings. Some archaeologists argue that it may have played a more decisive role in human expansion. The peninsula, they suggest, may have acted as more than just a corridor. it may have been an active launch pad from which populations spread into Asia. If this is true, then Arabia is not only witness to humanity's earliest journeys, but a center from which the world itself was reached. As Arabia's climate grew harsher in the deep past, new patterns of settlement began to form. By the first millennium BCE, organized communities had risen across the peninsula, developing into kingdoms that would shape the cultural identity of the region. Among the earliest known were the Thamud, who lived in the northwestern parts of the Arabian Peninsula. Their reputation for cutting dwellings out of sheer rock faces is well attested. Archaeological remains show entrances, chambers, and carved facades still etched into sandstone cliffs, preserved across millennia. They appear not only in later Islamic tradition, but also in earlier Assyrian records, suggesting that their fame as skilled builders extended far beyond Arabia itself. Today, the remnants of their rock-cut architecture remain silent witnesses to a society that mastered the raw cliffs of the desert and turned them into homes and monuments. Moving south to the oasis of Al-Ula, another power rose that would dominate the northwestern trade corridors. The Lihyanite kingdom, named after the tribe that led it, flourished between the 6th and 2nd centuries BCE. Their capital, Dedan, controlled vital caravan routes linking southern Arabia with Mesopotamia and beyond. Unlike purely oral cultures, the Lihyanaites left behind inscriptions in their own writing system, one of several distinct scripts across ancient Arabia. These inscriptions provide evidence of administration, religious practices, and even a glimpse of daily activities. Over time, this script proved influential by helping shape the later development of the Arabic alphabet, showing how cultural innovations carried long-term consequences across languages and civilizations. Farther north, a new community would take desert trade to an entirely different scale. The Nabateans, who emerged around the 4th century BCE, are best known for their capital city, Petra, in today's Jordan, with its rock-cut tombs and temples. Their influence, however, stretched deep into modern Saudi Arabia, where their monumental necropolis at Madain Saleh, also called Al-Hijra, still stands. Carved into rose-colored sandstone cliffs, rows of monumental tombs mark the site as one of the most important archaeological locations in the kingdom today. Recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, Al-Hijra demonstrates both the Nabateans' architectural skill and the extent of their reach. These tombs, with their decorated facades, reveal a blending of Hellenistic, Mesopotamian, and local Arabian styles, underscoring the cosmopolitan connections they maintained across regions. The prosperity of these kingdoms was not based solely on craftsmanship or location. Their true wealth came from trade. The Arabian Peninsula, far from being an isolated desert, became the spine of a global network that carried luxury goods across continents. Frankincense harvested in the southern highlands, spices from India, and other coveted products traveled northward through caravan routes under the protection of local rulers. The Thamud, the Lihyanaites, and the Nabateans all drew immense income by controlling these flows. In effect, the desert became a bridge, linking Africa and Asia to the Mediterranean world. One remarkable feature of Nabatean success came from their ability to manage scarce water. They engineered hidden cisterns, channels, and reservoirs, carefully concealed or carved into bedrock to trap every drop of rainfall. This advanced system allowed settlements like Petra and Al-Hijra to thrive in landscapes where survival seemed nearly impossible. It also reveals how societies of the ancient Arabian world pursued technological solutions fitted precisely to their environment. Another striking discovery is the existence of Greek inscriptions in parts of Saudi Arabia, left by Nabatean merchants. These inscriptions highlight the active contact between Arabian traders and the wider Hellenistic world, showing that the peninsula stood firmly within a web of Mediterranean commercial and cultural exchange. Hidden within Arabia's harsh deserts was a resource so prized that it transformed dusty caravan paths into the arteries of ancient trade. This was frankincense and myrrh, aromatic resins harvested from trees in the southern reaches of the peninsula. These sticky droplets were collected by cutting into the bark, left to dry, and then scraped into precious clumps which merchants carried north. In ancient societies, these substances were not simple luxury items. They carried spiritual weight, used in temples from Egypt to Rome, in funerary rites, in medicines, and as the basis for perfumes that defined status and power. Demand for them was so strong in antiquity that writers described them as worth more than gold, a claim that reveals just how much these humble resins dominated global markets. The trade that grew from this demand was not small. Long caravans of camels transported sacks of resin, spices, and other goods across unrelenting deserts. Routes stretched northward toward Mesopotamian cities along the Euphrates, westward to Egypt, and across to ports feeding into the Mediterranean system. In addition to frankincense and myrrh, traders carried cinnamon, pepper, precious stones, and textiles, linking India and East Africa to the wider Greco-Roman world. This constant flow of goods gave rise to wealthy intermediary cities in Arabia that profited by taxing caravans, protecting routes, and offering rest for travelers. These hubs became not only markets, but also points where ideas, languages, and cultures met. For this reason, some historians call Arabia the Silk Road of sense, a vivid reminder that the region's deserts masked the engine of global commerce. The scale of this trade impressed even the most powerful empires. A famous example comes from 1st century Rome, where Emperor Nero ordered that a vast quantity of frankincense be burned during the funeral rites of his wife in 65 CE. Writers recorded that this single ceremony consumed the equivalent of an entire year's import from Arabia. To his contemporaries, this act was shocking, not just for its extravagance, but for what it suggested about Rome's ability to command goods from the edges of the known world. For Arabian merchants, however, events like this only fueled the reputation of their homeland as the sole source of a sacred product that no empire could replicate. The southern regions of modern Oman and Yemen grew especially rich as the centers of production. The wealth generated there financed the construction of monumental structures, including temples and administrative buildings whose size and ambition rivaled some of the better-known achievements of Greece and Rome. These societies built irrigation systems, walled cities, and sanctuaries dedicated to gods associated with fertility and prosperity, all made possible by the profits of resin shipments. Archaeological evidence shows that these temples were not small shrines, but massive constructions, evidence of a civilization built directly on the foundation of trade networks stretching thousands of kilometers. It's easy to underestimate how trade in small packets of resin reshaped entire landscapes. Caravan routes required wells, forts, and oases to be secured along the way. Pilots and farmers in southern Arabia tended to trees that demanded careful cultivation and protection. Camel herders ensured long journeys could continue without collapse under the desert sun. Each group became part of an interlocking system that bound the peninsula to empires far beyond its borders. The influence of these routes outlived the kingdoms that managed them. Even centuries later, long after Rome fell, echoes of this commerce could be traced in the continued prestige of Arabia as the land that once carried the world's fragrance north. By the centuries before the rise of Islam, Mecca had already established itself as one of the most prominent centers in Arabia. While southern kingdoms thrived on frankincense and long-distance trade, the Hijaz region developed around routes that tied together local tribes and merchants. Mecca's position in this landscape gave it both economic and spiritual weight. Unlike other towns scattered across the peninsula, Mecca was not built on fertile land or near major rivers. Instead, its advantage came from location. Caravans carrying goods from South Arabia, East Africa, and even India often passed near its valleys. Merchants could stop to rest, trade, and resupply, making it an essential connection point between regions with resources and empires that demanded them. This constant movement of goods made Mecca economically prosperous and strategically vital. At the heart of Mecca stood the Kaaba, a cube-shaped sanctuary that has been the focus of reverence for centuries. In pre-Islamic times, it housed idols representing different Arabian tribes. Each group viewed their connection to the shrine as a marker of identity and status. The Kaaba's sanctity was secured by associated rituals, making it more than just a monument. Pilgrimage to Mecca was already a widespread practice long before Islam. People traveled to honor their deities, to perform rites, and to affirm intertribal connections. This steady flow of pilgrims not only reinforced the city's religious status, but also created a dependable source of revenue. With visitors came markets, seasonal gatherings, and opportunities for trade on a large scale. Religious devotion and commerce became tightly woven together in the city's rise. This environment unfolded within a peninsula shaped by tribal societies. Kinship determined loyalty, and disputes between groups often sparked conflict. Yet even in this world of rivalry, tribes shared customs that connected them on a cultural level. Poetry played a central part in that unity. Verses composed at tribal gatherings captured honor, memory, and pride. In a land where writing was rare, oral recitation served as both entertainment and the preservation of history. Some poets achieved immense recognition, and their works carried the weight of political influence. It is said that particularly celebrated compositions were displayed at the Kaaba, signifying their importance not only to tribes, but also to the community as a whole. In this sense, Mecca became the stage where art, spirituality, and politics intersected. What gave Mecca distinctive character was its openness to the wider world. Located along caravan paths linking the Red Sea trade to inland Arabia, it welcomed goods from beyond the peninsula. Spices from India, silks from China, glassware from Byzantium, and textiles from Persia could all appear in its markets. Merchants crossed paths with Africans, Persians, and Greeks, exchanging both items and ideas. This cosmopolitan atmosphere exposed Meccans to different religions, cultural practices, and political developments. As a result, even while Arabia remained largely tribal and fragmented, Mecca developed an outlook shaped by contact with distant lands. It was not just a city bound by its desert environment, but a node in a much broader network. Among the most intriguing features of the Kaaba is the black stone, set in one of its corners. Revered long before Islam, its origins remain a subject of debate. Some historians suggest it could be a meteorite, which would explain its perceived celestial significance. Whatever its nature, the stones symbolize the link between heaven and earth, echoing the way Mecca connected diverse peoples, tribes, and traditions. At the crossroads of faith and trade, poetry and politics, the city stood uniquely prepared for transformations that were soon to come. In the year 570 CE, during a period often referred to as the Year of the Elephant in Arabian tradition. A child named Muhammad ibn Abdullah was born in the city of Mecca. He belonged to the Quraysh tribe, a powerful group that oversaw the city's trade and its sacred shrine, the Kaaba. Arabia at this time was not a unified land but a patchwork of tribes, each with their own gods, loyalties, and rivalries. While the Kaaba acted as a shared religious center, daily life was dominated by conflicts between clans, shifting alliances, and a deep attachment to customary codes of honor. Politically fragmented and religiously diverse, the peninsula included Jewish communities, Christians, and followers of local pagan traditions. Such an environment made Mecca a city shaped by both economic interests and spiritual competition. Muhammad lost his parents at an early age and was raised under the care of relatives. Despite his lack of wealth or social standing, he became known for his honesty in trade. Merchants who dealt with him valued his integrity so highly that he earned the title Al-Amin, the trustworthy one. This reputation followed him long before he ever spoke of prophecy, giving credibility to his character in a society that measured a man's worth by his loyalty and truthfulness. His youth included travels on trading caravans that carried goods across Arabia and into neighboring regions. Through these journeys, he observed the practices of other cultures and faiths, experiences that broadened his perspective during a time when most people lived in limited tribal circles. At the age of 40, while meditating in a cave outside Mecca, Muhammad experienced the first of a series of revelations. According to Islamic tradition, these came through the angel Jibril, known in Christianity and Judaism as Gabriel. Over the following years, these revelations continued, forming what would become the Quran. The core of his message was strikingly simple, yet revolutionary. There is only one God, and all people are accountable to Him. Alongside this call to monotheism were teachings about justice, generosity to the poor, fair treatment of women, and honesty in dealings. In a society where wealth and lineage often dictated power, such ideas challenged not only the religious landscape, but also the social hierarchy. The Quraysh elite viewed his speeches as a direct threat to their dominance over Mecca's religious institutions. If idol worship was abandoned, their control over shrines and the profits from pilgrimages might weaken. As a result, Muhammad and his early followers faced escalating hostility. They were mocked, socially ostracized, and in some cases, violently attacked. Yet, instead of halting his mission, persecution seemed to strengthen his community. Many of those drawn to his message were the marginalized, slaves, the poor, and individuals overlooked by Meccan aristocracy. For them, the promise of equality before one God offered dignity in a society that often denied it. Even Mecca's revered poets, who rivaled each other with elaborate verses, struggled to match the impact of the Quran's phrasing. Listened to in gatherings, its recitation struck audiences as incomparable, surpassing anything composed in the tribal contests of the day. This linguistic power gave Islam a unique advantage. It not only introduced a new faith, but also unified the Arabic language into a common cultural frame. In a land divided by lineage and dialect, the Quran became both scripture and an enduring foundation for identity across Arabia. In the year 622 CE, the situation in Mecca had grown so hostile that Muhammad and his followers faced daily threats to their safety. The leaders of the Quraysh were determined to silence him, fearing that his call to worship one God undermined both their authority and the economic importance of idol worship in Mecca. At this critical moment, Muhammad and his followers made the decision to move north to the oasis city of Yathrib, later known as Medina. This migration, known as the Hijra, was not just a physical journey. It represented a turning point, so significant that the Islamic calendar begins with this event. For the early Muslim community, it symbolized a new beginning and the first chance to live openly according to their faith. Settling in Medina, Muhammad took on a role that was both spiritual and political. This was the first time his message was not confined to private gatherings, but expressed in the organization of a functioning community. Medina was home to multiple groups, Arab tribes, both pagan and newly converted Muslims, as well as long-established Jewish clans. With these diverse populations came disputes, rivalries, and competing interests. To stabilize these tensions, Muhammad oversaw the drafting of the Constitution of Medina. This agreement is considered one of the earliest documents in history to outline rights and responsibilities across religious and tribal lines. It granted security of faith to different communities while recognizing Muhammad's leadership in legal and political matters. By linking faith with governance, Medina became the foundation of what could be described as the first Islamic state. Life in Medina was not free from challenges. Raids and skirmishes with the Meccans soon escalated into larger conflicts, the most notable being the battles of Badr, Uhud, and the Trench. Each of these encounters tested the resilience of the new community. Though outnumbered, the Muslims' survival against stronger Meccan forces convinced many that Muhammad's leadership carried divine support. These confrontations also shifted the balance of power, as victory in Badr provided prestige while later struggles hardened the resolve of the Muslim population. Step by step, the community in Medina grew in strength, attracting new followers while gaining recognition across Arabia. By 630 CE, the balance had completely changed. Muhammad led his followers back to Mecca, no longer as an isolated prophet, but as the head of a powerful movement. The surrender of the city took place with little resistance. Muhammad then entered the Kaaba, which for centuries had been filled with idols of tribal gods. These were removed, and the shrine was rededicated to the worship of one God. This act turned the Kaaba into the central symbol of monotheism in Arabia and secured Mecca's role as a spiritual capital for the growing faith. Within less than a decade, Muhammad had achieved what had once seemed impossible. Diverse tribes, long accustomed to conflict, now accepted unity under Islam. By the time of his death in 632 CE, the Arabian Peninsula was transformed from a divided land of competing clans into a single religious and political entity. The speed of this transformation astonished contemporaries and left a foundation that extended far beyond his lifetime. In little more than 2 decades, a new civilization had emerged with Arabia at its core. When Muhammad died in 632 CE, questions of leadership came quickly to the forefront of the new Muslim community. Authority passed to the Rashidun caliphs, beginning with Abu Bakr, then followed by Umar, Uthman, and Ali. Their leadership was marked not only by maintaining unity within Arabia, but by expansion rapidly outward. Within just a few decades, Muslim armies had reached Syria, Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Persia. For the tribes of Arabia, who had known only local rivalries and raids, this expansion projected their influence across entire empires. It tied the desert homeland tightly to a world stretching from North Africa to Central Asia. Even as power extended far away, Arabia itself did not lose its central place in the faith. Mecca and Medina held spiritual significance as the home of the Kaaba and the Prophet's Mosque, symbols that anchored the expanding Islamic community to its Arabian roots. By the mid-7th century, a shift occurred. The Umayyad dynasty, which rose to power in 661 CE, built its capital in Damascus. From there, they governed a vast realm that, at its height, stretched from Spain to the banks of the Indus River. This was a change from the earlier pattern of leadership based directly in Arabia. The holy cities remained revered, but politically, the peninsula itself had less direct influence. Tribes still carried local authority, and the pilgrimage ensured Arabia's continued wealth, but decisions about empire now came from outside. For Arabia, the balance became clear. While it no longer directed global politics, it commanded spiritual authority that no ruler outside could ignore. The Umayyads themselves relied heavily on pilgrimage as a source of legitimacy. Rulers invested resources in maintaining order among the Hajj roads, ensuring that Muslims across the empire could travel safely to Mecca each year. Caravans of tens of thousands of people came from Damascus, Baghdad, Cairo, and beyond. The sight of these processions was a reminder of unity across geography, language, and culture. Contemporary accounts describe lines of travelers stretching across the desert, with wells, shelters, and guards placed along the way. Later writers compared these routes to highways of faith, indicating how organized the flow of pilgrims had become. A new transformation began in 750 CE with the Abbasid revolution. Centered in Baghdad, this dynasty shifted the cultural and political heart of the Muslim world to Mesopotamia. Arabia did not contain the seat of government, but its sacred role deepened. The Abbasids knew that control over the holy cities gave symbolic legitimacy to their rule. Even from Baghdad, they invested in Mecca and Medina, funding renovations to the Kaaba and facilities for pilgrims. In return, Arabia benefited from an influx of wealth, ideas, and knowledge carried by visitors. During the Abbasid period, Mecca became more than a ritual center. It emerged as a hub of intellectual exchange. Pilgrims did not arrive only with prayers. They carried navigation charts from the Indian Ocean, medical treatises from Persia, and astronomical tables from Central Asia. In the markets of Mecca, spices and fabrics were traded alongside manuscripts and instruments. For rulers in far-off courts, the Hajj was both a spiritual obligation and a channel for cultural transmission. Arabia's deserts thus became a backdrop for exchanges that shaped science, medicine, and art across the Islamic world. The peninsula may not have directed empire, but as a place where faith and knowledge intersected, it continued to matter in ways far beyond its borders. In the early 1500s, a dramatic shift occurred in the political landscape of Arabia, when the Ottoman Empire extended its authority over the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. The Ottomans, already a dominant force in the Middle East, North Africa, and much of southeastern Europe, recognized the importance of these sites not only for religious reasons, but also as a source of legitimacy for their expanding empire. By taking control of Islam's most sacred places, the sultans reinforced their position as leaders of the Muslim world. Holding the title of caliph, they presented themselves as guardians of the faith who carried the responsibility of protecting and maintaining the holy sanctuaries visited by millions of Muslims over the centuries. From the outset, the Ottoman rulers understood that control alone would not be enough. They invested vast resources in safeguarding and improving the infrastructure that supported the pilgrimage. Renovations included extensive works on the Kaaba itself and on the Prophet's mosque in Medina. Over time, the sultans financed the repair of walls, domes, and courtyards, while also improving roads and facilities along the pilgrimage routes. This made the Hajj not only safer, but also more accessible to Muslims traveling from far beyond Arabia. For many pilgrims undertaking a journey that spanned thousands of kilometers, the reassurance that the Ottoman state provided stability and protection was just as valuable as the sacred destination itself. While the cities were fully integrated into the Ottoman administrative system, they retained a degree of local authority. Governance on the ground was often carried out by the Sharifs of Mecca, descendants of the Prophet Muhammad. These lineages carried immense prestige and were respected by the population for their close connection to the Holy City. The Ottomans recognized their importance and maintained a delicate balance by leaving them in charge of local religious matters, while still affirming Ottoman sovereignty through oversight and military presence. This arrangement reflected the dual nature of Ottoman rule, combining central authority with local legitimacy. A defining feature of this era was the scale and organization of the pilgrimage routes under Ottoman supervision. Caravans left annually from major cities such as Damascus, Cairo, and later Istanbul. These processions numbered in the thousands and were accompanied by armed escorts, ensuring protection against raids along the way. For many observers, the sight of these long convoys moving across the desert highlighted the unifying power of faith that could bring people together from so many different provinces of a vast empire. Accounts from the time describe these caravans as legendary undertakings, with tents, camels, and provisions stretching over the horizon. The seriousness with which the Ottomans approached the defense of the holy cities can also be seen in their construction projects. One striking example is the Ajad fortress built in the 18th century above Mecca. Its purpose was to defend against outside threats, providing a visible reminder that military protection of the sacred sites was considered a priority of state. Actions like this underscored the Ottoman claim to guardianship over the shrines of Islam. Alongside protection, the empire maintained a symbolic tradition known as the Surrey procession. Each year, a grand convoy departed from Istanbul, carrying gold, gifts, and supplies destined for Mecca and Medina. The ceremony not only supplied the cities with needed resources, but also sent a powerful message. The holy sites were connected to the entire Muslim world through the Sultan's generosity. In this way, the pilgrimage became more than an individual act of devotion. It was transformed into a living symbol of global unity under Islam, tied together by the authority of the Ottoman caliphs. In the middle of the 18th century, a religious movement began in Central Arabia that would reshape the political map of the region. At its center was Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab, an Islamic scholar born in 1703 in the Najd area. He argued that generations of Muslims had strayed from the true teachings of Islam. In his view, many customs that had developed over centuries, such as visiting shrines to seek blessings, honoring the graves of saints, or practicing certain rituals, were unacceptable innovations. He called for a complete return to the earliest form of Islam as practiced during the time of the Prophet Muhammad and his companions. This strict interpretation placed an uncompromising emphasis on monotheism and regarded anything outside it as dangerous deviation. On its own, Ibn Abd al-Wahhab's message might not have spread far beyond local debates among scholars. What made his vision powerful was his alliance with Muhammad ibn Saud, the ruler of the small town of Diriyah. In 1744, the two men forged a pact. The religious authority of Ibn Abd al-Wahhab would be matched by the political power of Ibn Saud. Together, they established a model in which reform and authority were combined, binding spiritual purity to the expansion of state power. This partnership is remembered as the foundation of the first Saudi state. From Diriyah, this new state grew rapidly. Over the next decades, tribes across the Najd region and beyond were drawn into the movement, either through persuasion or armed campaigns. The appeal of the alliance lay in its clear message and its ability to unify clans under a strong vision of both faith and leadership. By the beginning of the 19th century, Wahhabi-Saudi forces had expanded their reach over most of Central Arabia. Their influence did not stop there. Pushing outward, they captured the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, bringing the heart of Islam under their authority. The control of the holy sites represented more than territorial power. By ruling over Mecca and Medina, the Saudis claimed guardianship of the two most sacred sites in Islam, elevating their influence across the Muslim world. Yet their practices set them apart from many other Islamic traditions of the time. Pilgrims arriving for Hajj under their authority encountered bans on tobacco and musical instruments, habits that had been part of religious gatherings for years. Such measures shocked visitors who associated the pilgrimage with long-standing customs. The difference highlighted how deeply the Wahhabi emphasis on strict monotheism shaped public life in regions under Saudi control. This sudden rise alarmed the Ottoman Empire, which regarded itself as the rightful protector of the holy cities. Unable to tolerate the loss of Mecca and Medina, the Ottomans turned to their powerful governor in Egypt, Muhammad Ali Pasha. In 1811, a campaign was launched to destroy the Saudi Wahhabi power. Egyptian forces, equipped with modern weapons and organized armies, pushed deep into the peninsula. After years of fighting, they reached Diriyah in 1818. The town was besieged, captured, and systematically razed to the ground. The first Saudi state collapsed under the attack, its leaders executed or driven into exile. Yet the story did not end with destruction. Even though Diriyah lay in ruins, the religious and political vision of Ibn Abd al-Wahhab and Ibn Saud survived. Among tribes of Najd, loyalty to the Saudi Wahhabi alliance remained strong, preserving the ideas that would later resurface, laying the groundwork for further Saudi states to come. After the fall of Diriyah in 1818, it seemed that the Saudi Wahhabi alliance had been decisively crushed. Yet only a few years later, the cause found new energy under the leadership of Turki ibn Abdullah. In 1824, Turkey succeeded in capturing Riyadh, a city that would soon replace Diriyah as the center of Saudi authority. From this victory emerged the second Saudi state. Though it began small, the new state reflected the resilience of the Al Saud family and their desire to re-establish political power in Central Arabia. Riyadh, positioned on vital desert routes, provided a defensible and strategic base from which the Saudis could begin rebuilding their influence over the Najd region. The rise of the second Saudi state came with numerous challenges. Unlike the dramatic expansion of the first Saudi polity, the new state grew in a fragmented political environment. Arabia was dotted with rival dynasties and tribal confederations, with each seeking control over limited resources such as oases, trade routes, and grazing grounds. Chief among the rivals was the Rashidi dynasty, based in Ha'il, in the northern region of Jebel Shamar. The Rashidis, supported by well-organized alliances and ties to the Ottomans, represented a formidable counterweight to the Saudi leadership in Riyadh. Their rivalry defined the politics of Central Arabia for much of the 19th century, shaping the rise and fall of both powers. Despite these difficulties, the revival of Riyadh as a Saudi stronghold carried symbolic weight. The city became a rallying point where the traditions of Wahhabi teaching and the political authority of the Al Saud family were reasserted. Although its reach never matched the territorial expanse of the first Saudi state, the second Saudi state did successfully re-establish Wahhabi influence throughout much of Central Arabia. This persistence kept alive the religious and political partnership first forged in the 18th century, ensuring that the movement would not fully disappear even after military defeat. Internal struggles, however, repeatedly undermined the strength of the state. Leadership within the Al Saud family often passed through conflict, with cousins and brothers contesting succession and occasionally resorting to open confrontation. These disputes weakened cohesion and distracted the state from external threats. As power exchanged hands, stability fluctuated, allowing rivals like the Rashidis greater opportunity to expand their reach. In many ways, it was these family divisions, more than external enemies alone, that made it impossible for the second Saudi state to achieve lasting dominance. By the late 1800s, the Rashidis had grown into the principal power in Central Arabia. With their base in Ha'il and support from Ottoman authorities who were eager to curb Saudi resurgence, the Rashidis pressed southward. Their military strength outmatched the divided Saudis, and a decisive confrontation came in 1891. The Rashidis inflicted defeat at the Battle of Mulaida, crushing the second Saudi state and forcing members of the Al Saud family into exile. Stripped of their power and territory, the once revived state collapsed, leaving Riyadh vulnerable and the Najd region under Rashidi ascendancy. Although smaller and shorter-lived than its predecessor, the second Saudi state remained important for one major reason. It proved that the Saudi-Wahhabi alliance could survive devastation and reform under new conditions. Even in exile, the Al Saud family carried their legacy with them. Their retreat into Kuwait marked not an end, but a pause. Within just a decade, a young exile named Abdulaziz ibn Saud would begin plotting the restoration of his family's fortunes. From the loss of 1891 would arise the foundations of the modern kingdom of Saudi Arabia. In the early hours of January 1902, a small group of barely more than 60 men rode quietly toward the city of Riyadh. Leading them was a 26-year-old exile who had spent years in Kuwait waiting for a chance to restore his family's lost power. His name was Abdulaziz ibn Saud. The Saud family had once ruled Central Arabia, but defeat at the hands of the Rashidi dynasty forced them into exile by the end of the 19th century. Abdulaziz was determined to change that. What followed was one of the most daring raids in Arabian history, one that would reshape the future of the entire peninsula. The plan was both simple and dangerous. Abdulaziz and his men disguised themselves, approached the city by night, and quietly entered the old fort at Riyadh. To succeed, they had to overpower the Rashidi guards quickly and silence them before any alarm was raised. Accounts say that the fighting inside the fort was intense but fast. Despite their small numbers, Abdulaziz's men gained the upper hand. By morning, the banner of the House of Saud once again flew over Riyadh. For the Rashidis, it was a stunning loss. For Abdulaziz, it was only the beginning of what would become a 50-year campaign to unite Arabia under his rule. Once in control of Riyadh, Abdulaziz secured his position carefully. He did not attempt reckless expansion right away. Instead, he consolidated power in Najd, the heartland of Central Arabia, forging alliances with tribes through marriage, negotiation, and a shared sense of faith. His leadership style combined military daring with patience, always balancing loyalty with strength. Many rival leaders relied heavily on tribal raiding and shifting alliances. Abdulaziz, however, created something more durable by linking politics with a religious cause. That cause came in the form of the Ikhwan, a movement of Bedouin tribesmen who embraced a strict vision of Islam and became loyal soldiers of Abdulaziz. Unlike the loosely formed tribal bands of other leaders, the Ikhwan acted as a disciplined fighting force motivated not just by plunder, but by a belief that they were serving their faith. Their presence allowed Abdulaziz to project authority across the desert in ways earlier chiefs could not. When he launched campaigns into surrounding regions, these fighters provided both strength and legitimacy. The raid on Riyadh has often been compared to a desert version of the Trojan horse, a tiny force overwhelming a city much larger than itself. It is remembered because it marks more than just a military victory. It symbolized the rebirth of the House of Saud, a name that had already risen and fallen once before in Arabia's turbulent landscape. This time, the dynasty would endure, powered by Abdulaziz's vision and determination. Over the next decades, Abdulaziz expanded step by step. He used both war and diplomacy, but he also relied on his ability to inspire loyalty and maintain order. His leadership stood out at a time when tribal alliances often dissolved quickly. Abdulaziz created stability through his personal authority and by building relationships that extended beyond conquest. He continued ruling for over a half a century, his reign stretching into the mid-20th century. During that time, he fathered more than 40 sons, a detail which may seem like a footnote but became central to Saudi Arabia's political history. His descendants established a dynastic system in which power would pass from one son to the next, shaping the monarchy into the state known today. The legacy of his improbable strike into Riyadh reached far beyond the walls of that fortress. It became the foundation for a new kingdom that would soon unify deserts, tribes, and holy cities under one rule. After the dramatic recapture of Riyadh in 1902, Abdulaziz ibn Saud faced a task that few leaders before him had managed to sustain for long: the complete unification of Arabia. Over the next 3 decades, he relied on persistence, calculated diplomacy, and military campaigns to expand his control from the central deserts of Najd outward. Unlike earlier rulers who had attempted similar ambitions only to see their domains vanish after a generation, Abdulaziz built slowly and consolidated carefully after each conquest, making sure local tribes or city leaders were tied to him through alliances as much as through force. His first major target was Al-Hassa, the eastern coastal province strategically bordering the Persian Gulf. This fertile region offered access to ports and rich agricultural lands, providing not only sustenance for his growing state, but also routes for trade and future possibilities of naval connection. In 1913, his forces secured Al-Hassa and its nearby oases, bringing a valuable economic center under his control. With this victory, Abdulaziz gained recognition far beyond Najd. The Ottoman Empire, still claiming nominal sovereignty over the region, acknowledged his authority there rather than risk a prolonged struggle. In this way, his expansion was not just military, but also diplomatic, a balance he would use often in the years ahead. Attention then turned to the Hejaz, the western region containing the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. These cities had extraordinary importance not only for Arabia, but for Muslims worldwide. They were symbols of legitimacy, and whoever controlled them could claim a special role as guardian of the faith. In the 1920s, the Hashemite rulers of the Hejaz struggled with both regional politics and the costs of maintaining control over the vast territory. Abdulaziz recognized this vulnerability. By 1925, after a combination of battles and negotiated surrenders, he marched into Mecca and Medina, presenting himself as both a unifier and a protector of Islam's sacred shrines. This moment transformed his rule from regional authority into one with significance across the Islamic world. To the south, the rugged region of Asir posed a different challenge. It was a mountainous zone with its own traditions of autonomy and resilience. Through a mixture of agreements with tribal leaders and armed campaigns, Abdulaziz gradually enforced his rule there by the late 1920s. The incorporation of Asir strengthened the geographic unity of his domain, plugging a gap between Hijaz and Najd. By this stage, he controlled an area larger than many European states combined, linked for the first time under a single king in centuries. Abdulaziz took great care in maintaining bonds with the tribes he absorbed. He frequently invited leaders to gatherings where enormous feasts were held, sometimes requiring hundreds of camels in a single event. These displays of generosity reinforced loyalty, showing that his rule promised prosperity and respect rather than simple domination. It was an old custom adapted to serve a new political reality. His charisma, coupled with the shared commitment of his followers, gave his kingdom stability that Husainid or Rashidi rulers had never fully achieved. On September 23, 1932, Abdulaziz declared the establishment of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, bringing the disparate regions of Najd, Hijaz, Asir, and Al-Hassa together into a single sovereign state. The unification marked the end of centuries of tribal fighting that had left Arabia fragmented. In its place stood a monarchy that claimed both tribal descent and religious guardianship, intertwining political and spiritual legitimacy. The process itself was remarkable, because where most imperial projects of the modern age relied on rifles, machines, and external powers, Abdulaziz's campaigns were still fought largely with cavalry and traditional weaponry. Historians often describe it as one of the last significant conquests on horseback in modern times. It was an achievement that bridged old Arabia and the new century, laying the groundwork for a state that within a few years would be thrust into an age defined not by horses, but by oil. In the early decades of the 20th century, remained much the same as it had for centuries. The kingdom's economy depended heavily on seasonal pilgrimage to Mecca and Medina, and beyond that, income largely came from small-scale trade and local agriculture. Caravans still crossed stretches of desert with little sign of permanent infrastructure, and most communities lived without electricity or advanced medicine. For Abdulaziz, who had fought for decades to unify the country, building a state remained a daunting challenge in an environment where resources were scarce. Few could have predicted that beneath the sands lay reserves that would transform not only Saudi Arabia, but also the balance of global energy. The turning point came in 1933, when Saudi Arabia signed an agreement with American geologists, granting exploration rights that would bring specialized equipment and expertise into the kingdom. For several years, early drilling efforts were met with disappointment. Dry wells or insignificant amounts of crude made it seem as though the desert might not yield much after all. Then, in 1938, their persistence finally paid off at a site known as Dammam No. 7. Nicknamed the Prosperity Well, it marked the beginning of commercial oil production in Saudi Arabia. This single breakthrough shifted the reputation of the kingdom from a remote desert land into a rising energy state, with vast reserves soon confirmed in the surrounding region. The company responsible, the Arabian American Oil Company, or Aramco, quickly expanded operations. What started as an isolated production site evolved into a growing system of pipelines, storage facilities, and shipping terminals. Tankers began to carry Saudi oil across the Gulf, connecting the desert kingdom with global markets for the first time in its history. Abdulaziz, cautious but ambitious, directed the new revenues into the foundations of a modern state. Roads were laid down where before there had been only sand tracks, and ports were updated to handle not only oil exports but also general trade. Healthcare and education, almost non-existent in most regions before this time, were also addressed with new funds. Clinics and hospitals began appearing in major towns, along with schools that introduced literacy and basic training to young Saudis. For many citizens, this was the first direct experience of what modern statehood could offer. Oil wealth allowed the government to provide visible benefits, forging stronger ties between the monarchy and its people. Each improvement further distinguished Saudi Arabia from its recent past as a land of isolated tribes and sporadic resources. One of the earliest and most significant partnerships born out of this development was with the United States. While the kingdom gained access to technical skills, drilling knowledge, and industrial equipment, America secured a reliable source of petroleum. This relationship grew rapidly, extending beyond economic exchange into broader political cooperation. In a period where European colonial influence still dominated much of the Middle East, the American-Saudi connection was unique, built primarily on trade and mutual interest rather than direct governance. Before oil, the most profitable export of the kingdom had been dates, harvested across its oases and shipped to markets from India to the Mediterranean. Even today, the country remains a massive producer, with over 1 million tons grown annually. Yet, once oil entered the picture, agriculture quickly faded in economic importance, overshadowed by the sheer scale of petroleum income. The contrast between these two sources of revenue illustrates how sudden the transformation was. The pace of change accelerated quickly. Within 20 years of the first successful well, many areas that had never experienced electricity saw power lines stretching toward them. Airports appeared in regions where only camel caravans had once crossed. Pipelines snaked across the desert, linking drilling fields with terminals on the Gulf. Entire towns rose around industry camps run by Aramco, populated by both Saudis and foreign specialists. The nation, which entered the 20th century as one of the poorest in the region, was by mid-century on its way to becoming a global oil power. This rapid growth set the stage for the modern Saudi state and unlocked a new era where wealth from beneath the sand shaped every aspect of political, social, and economic life. When the Second World War erupted in 1939, Saudi Arabia remained a newly unified state built on the momentum of Ibn Saud's decades of campaigns. Officially, the kingdom adopted a stance of neutrality, avoiding direct military involvement in the conflict. Yet, neutrality did not mean isolation. The expanding war quickly placed Saudi Arabia's resources, location, and political choices under intense international scrutiny. Oil, which only the previous year had begun flowing from the major wells discovered near Dammam, was becoming vital to modern warfare. Aviation fuel, naval diesel, and mechanized armies all relied on petroleum in unprecedented quantities. What had seemed like a new industry for a desert kingdom now became a resource essential to the Allied war effort. By the early 1940s, oil demand soared as fleets, bombers, tanks, and supply convoys consumed staggering volumes each day. Britain, already with ties across the Gulf, and the United States, emerging as an industrial powerhouse, both recognized how critical Saudi reserves could be. Although Saudi exports were still small compared to the vast fields in places like Iran or Iraq, the kingdom's role grew steadily alongside American-operated Aramco facilities. Saudi Arabia did not side openly with either camp, but supplies quietly helped strengthen Allied logistics. The fact that Saudi territory sat on the land bridge between the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf also gave it strategic significance. In an era of global choke points, controlling safe corridors for fuel and supplies mattered as much as raw production. Despite maintaining neutrality, Ibn Saud faced internal challenges brought forth by the war. Allied leaders worried about Axis propaganda in the region, while the king himself needed financial stability to sustain his state. Pilgrimage revenues, the traditional backbone of the Arabian economy, dropped sharply during wartime as international travel became dangerous and restricted. With one primary income source strained, oil royalties from Aramco gained even greater importance. What had once been supplementary revenue now became an economic lifeline holding the kingdom together as conflict raged beyond its borders. The decisive moment in Saudi Arabia's shift onto the global stage came in February 1945, just weeks before the war's end in Europe. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, returning from the Yalta Conference with Churchill and Stalin, requested a meeting with Ibn Saud. They met aboard the USS Quincy, a U.S. Navy cruiser anchored in the Suez Canal. This was the first encounter between an American president and a Saudi king, yet its symbolism carried far greater weight than a ceremonial exchange. It set down what became the central bargain of modern Saudi-American relations: access to secure supplies of Saudi oil in exchange for political recognition, technical support, and long-term security guarantees from the United States. Ibn Saud, known for his caution, traveled to the meeting not by air but by ship, as he still refused to board an airplane. In contrast, Roosevelt arrived aboard a modern warship, underscoring the difference between a rising global superpower and a desert monarch guiding a young kingdom. Still, the discussions between them were marked by mutual respect. Though brief, they set the tone for decades ahead. Shortly after, American military advisors began training Saudi forces, while Aramco expanded exploration deep into the desert interior. That single handshake, forged aboard the Quincy, became the foundation of a partnership that has lasted for more than 80 years. From wartime cooperation grew a strategic alliance linking two vastly different nations around the shared imperatives of energy security and political stability. What began amid the chaos of global war charted a course that continues to shape oil markets, alliances, and conflicts worldwide. By the 1950s, Saudi Arabia was no longer a largely forgotten desert kingdom. Oil had begun to flow in quantities that few had imagined possible just 2 decades earlier, and revenues from these exports poured into the state's treasury. What had once been a meager economy built on pilgrimages and trade caravans now rested on a resource that carried global importance. As Western demand for petroleum accelerated in the post-war boom, Saudi Arabia positioned itself to capitalize on it, and the results changed the country at a pace unmatched in its earlier history. One of the clearest transformations came in infrastructure. New highways connected distant regions that for centuries had been linked only by camel trails. Where once most travel was slow and seasonal, cars now crossed wide stretches of the desert within hours. Ports expanded to handle increased shipping, and modern airports began to appear in Jeddah, Dhahran, and eventually Riyadh. These air links drew in people and goods from abroad while projecting Saudi Arabia outward into the growing international system. Building modern facilities was not a luxury. It was a necessity for a state now exporting millions of barrels of oil each week. Healthcare and education also advanced dramatically in these years. Hospitals equipped with Western-trained doctors opened in cities that had previously relied on traditional medicine. Clinics spread into smaller towns, and public health campaigns addressed diseases that had long plagued desert communities. For the first time, many Saudi children had access to formal schooling, with teachers provided not only from within the kingdom, but brought in from across the Arab world. Universities followed, including King Saud University in Riyadh, which became a major center for producing the next generation of Saudi professionals. Politically, the oil wealth broadened the reach of the monarchy. King Saud, who took the throne in 1953, used revenues to fund new ministries and extend government services into areas that had previously been managed only by local tribal authority. His successor, King Faisal, ascended in the 1960s and directed the kingdom onto a more active diplomatic path. Faisal worked not only to continue modernization, but also to build Saudi Arabia's voice in regional and global politics. Oil income allowed the kingdom to finance development without falling under heavy foreign debt, giving it a measure of independence that many other states lacked. A central institution throughout this era was Aramco. Still jointly operated with American companies, it became the backbone of both the Saudi economy and society. The company built not only drilling sites, but entire communities around them, complete with schools, clinics, and housing. Over time, the Saudi state moved toward greater involvement in Aramco, laying the groundwork for increased ownership that would eventually culminate in full national control decades later. By the 1970s, Saudi Arabia was no longer a secondary producer. It had become one of the leading exporters on Earth, commanding attention within the newly formed Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC. Through OPEC, Riyadh gained a collective voice in decisions that influence global markets. A resource that had once seemed hidden beneath unsettled desert was now at the center of international power balances. During this transformation, the kingdom's people experienced equally dramatic change. In the early 1960s, a large portion of the population still lived as nomadic herders, moving with their flocks across changing seasons. By the following decade, many of these groups were settling permanently in newly built towns where electricity, paved roads, and jobs tied to oil wealth drew them away from older patterns of life. A striking example of the speed of modernization can be seen in transportation. In less than 20 years, the country went from having fewer than 1,000 cars to filling multi-lane highways with modern traffic. It was a change so rapid that entire generations saw their lives reshaped within a single span of memory. In October 1973, the Yom Kippur War broke out as Egypt and Syria launched an attack against Israel. This conflict reverberated far beyond the Middle East borders because of the way Arab oil producers, led by Saudi Arabia, responded. The United States and several European countries were quick to support Israel with military aid, and in response, members of the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries declared an embargo on oil shipments to those nations. For Saudi Arabia, this decision was significant. Oil was no longer just a product fueling economic growth. It was now a political instrument that could be used to exert pressure on the international stage in ways that had never been seen before. The impact was immediate. Oil prices quadrupled in the span of just a few months, rising from about $3 per barrel to nearly $12. For countries dependent on imports, this surge was more than just an inconvenience. It was an economic shock that sent ripples throughout global markets. Industries tied to cheap fuel faced unprecedented costs. Inflation accelerated, and governments scrambled to adjust. For ordinary people across the United States and Western Europe, the crisis appeared most visibly at the gas pump. Long lines formed as stations ran out of fuel. Drivers waited for hours, and rationing systems were introduced in some areas. In several American cities, so-called car-free Sundays left highways eerily quiet. what had once seemed like an endless supply of inexpensive energy now revealed its fragility. For Saudi Arabia, the embargo achieved more than just economic disruption. It demonstrated for the first time that a single policy shift could alter the balance of power in global affairs. Unlike traditional military alliances or territorial negotiations, this was influence achieved using a resource buried beneath the sand. Western leaders were forced to recognize that access to Saudi oil was not guaranteed, and that relations with Riyadh had become critical to their own national security. The kingdom, which had spent much of the early 20th century consolidating internally, suddenly found itself at the center of world politics. Inside Saudi Arabia, soaring revenues transformed daily life. Oil profits that multiplied almost overnight were funneled into projects aimed at modernizing the country. Schools expanded rapidly, universities admitted growing numbers of students, and scholarships were offered for Saudis to study abroad. Hospitals were upgraded, new clinics were established, and child mortality rates began to decline as medical services reached populations that had long lacked them. Infrastructure projects reshaped the physical landscape, from paved roads stitching remote areas into the national grid to new housing projects designed to accommodate expanding urban centers. The sudden rush of wealth also created a new sense of identity for the kingdom. Once seen as a relatively modest state whose revenues from pilgrimage and early oil production had only just begun to grow, Saudi Arabia now wielded visible leverage over the strongest economies in the world. Its position within OPEC became especially powerful, as the group coordinated production quotas and pricing strategies that affected governments far beyond the Middle East. The crisis cemented the idea that Saudi Arabia was not simply an oil exporter, but rather a decisive actor in shaping the modern global economy. The events of 1973 left lasting consequences. Energy policies in the United States and Europe shifted almost immediately, with governments launching programs to search for alternative sources and to reduce consumption. But the broader lesson was clear. Saudi Arabia had established itself as one of the most strategically important nations on earth. With a single decision, it showed that control over oil was more than a matter of commerce. It was an instrument of international influence, capable of reshaping alliances, destabilizing economies, and reminding the world that the Desert Kingdom had become a power few could afford to ignore. In November 1979, the calm of Mecca was broken by one of the most serious crises in modern Saudi history. Hundreds of armed men, led by Juhayman al-Otaibi, stormed the Grand Mosque, Islam's holiest sanctuary, just as morning prayers had concluded. Pilgrims inside suddenly found themselves trapped as the group fortified the mosque with weapons smuggled into the courtyards and underground chambers. This seizure was not only an armed assault on the Saudi monarchy, but also a direct challenge to its role as guardian of the two great holy cities of Islam. The militants justified their actions by accusing the Saudi rulers of corruption, arguing that the kingdom had lost its Islamic purity. Juhayman's group even declared allegiance to a figure they claimed was the Mahdi, a messianic leader foretold in Islamic tradition. By choosing the Grand Mosque itself, they aimed to give their message ultimate religious weight. For the monarchy, however, the symbolism cut even deeper. Control over Mecca was central to its legitimacy on the world stage, and any sign of instability within the sanctuary risked undermining that authority. Saudi security forces immediately surrounded the compound, but retaking it proved far from simple. The mosque complex covered vast courtyards, upper floors, and a labyrinth of basements and tunnels unfamiliar to the attackers' pursuers. Every attempt to storm the site was met with coordinated resistance. Snipers hidden in the minarets pinned down soldiers, while militants barricaded upper galleries. The battle quickly turned into one of the most dangerous and drawn-out engagements the kingdom had faced inside its own territory. Days turned into weeks. As regular assaults faltered, Saudi forces sought external expertise. French advisors with experience in urban counter-terror operations were quietly brought in, though officially this involvement remained discreet to avoid the appearance of foreign non-Muslim soldiers entering the holy sanctuary. The advisors shared tactics and equipment, while Saudi troops carried out the operations themselves. These changes marked a shifting strategy after early missteps had resulted in heavy casualties. Beneath the mosque, the fight was even more difficult. The complex housed a series of catacombs and tunnels where militants stored supplies and staged ambushes. Moving through such confined spaces risked devastating losses. To dislodge the final holdouts, Saudi forces flooded part of the underground with gas, forcing rebels out into more open areas where fighting could be concluded. After nearly 2 weeks, control of the mosque was restored, but the price had been high in both Saudi casualties and global reputation. The event shocked Muslims worldwide. Until that moment, the idea of armed men bringing battle into the holiest site of Islam had been almost unimaginable. Governments across the Muslim world watched with alarm at both the brazenness of the attack and the uncertainty it exposed inside Saudi Arabia. The monarchy responded swiftly to repair its legitimacy. One immediate step was the strengthening of ties with the religious establishment. By empowering clerics further and adopting stricter social and cultural enforcement, the government sought to ease criticism from conservative groups within the kingdom. To prevent mass panic during the crisis, Saudi authorities even curtailed international broadcasts of pilgrimage coverage. This temporary measure was unprecedented but seen as vital to controlling the narrative and avoiding wider disorder. The siege left a mark far deeper than its weeks of fighting. It reshaped domestic policy, hardened religious authority, and reminded the ruling family how fragile control could appear when challenged within the walls of Mecca. In August 1990, the balance of power in the Gulf region changed overnight when Iraq's leader, Saddam Hussein, ordered his forces to invade neighboring Kuwait. Within days, Iraqi troops had occupied the small, oil-rich emirate and placed Saudi Arabia's northern border directly in the path of a hostile army. For King Fahd, the threat was clear. If Iraq extended its advance southward, it could take control not only of Saudi oil fields, but the strategic heart of the global petroleum industry. The survival of the kingdom itself seemed to be on the line. Faced with this danger, King Fahd made a decision that would define Saudi Arabia's international ties for decades to come. He invited American and coalition forces to station troops inside Saudi territory. This was not a small gesture. By late 1990, tens of thousands of U.S. soldiers, joined by British, French, and other allied forces, were positioned in the Saudi desert. It was the largest American military deployment the kingdom had ever seen, transforming Saudi soil into a forward base for one of the biggest multinational coalitions since World War II. As winter turned to 1991, the operation to liberate Kuwait began. Saudi Arabia became the staging ground for huge troop movements and the launching point for air campaigns that targeted Iraqi positions. Coalition aircraft took off from Saudi bases daily, while ground forces gathered for the eventual land war. The kingdom's geography made it indispensable, wide-open terrain that could host large numbers of troops and equipment close to the Kuwaiti front, yet far enough south to secure supply routes. For the United States, This partnership confirmed Saudi Arabia as a central ally in the Middle East. The long-standing relationship formed in the 1940s around oil now widened into open military cooperation. In return for providing secure energy supplies, the Saudis received not only equipment and training, but also a physical guarantee of defense against one of the most aggressive armies in the region. The Gulf War solidified this arrangement, embedding the idea of a U.S.-Saudi security bond as a fixture of global strategy. Yet, this alliance came with complications. The sight of foreign troops, especially large numbers of Americans, stationed close to Islam's holiest cities, unsettled many Muslims both inside and outside the kingdom. For centuries, outsiders had been restricted from entering certain sacred regions, and now modern armies were setting up bases a few hours from Mecca and Medina. Critics accuse the monarchy of compromising religious integrity for political survival. Among younger radicals in the Muslim world, this decision fueled opposition movements that later defined the 1990s and beyond. Economically, Saudi Arabia carried the enormous share of the burden. Estimates suggest the kingdom spent more than $50 billion supporting the coalition effort. Covering expenses ranging from supplies to infrastructure, the contribution underscored both Saudi wealth and its stake in ensuring Saddam Hussein's defeat. It was a financial outlay that demonstrated that the defense of the Gulf was not only an American interest, but also a fundamental Saudi one. The wider lesson of the Gulf War was striking. Saudi Arabia was no longer important solely as an oil supplier. It had become a vital strategic hub, capable of shaping military operations in one of the most contested regions of the world. The desert kingdom that once seemed distant from global affairs now stood at the crossroads of energy, security, and politics. Its choices reverberating far beyond its borders in a way that could not be ignored. The attacks of September 11, 2001, created an immediate crisis for Saudi Arabia. Out of the 19 men responsible for hijacking the planes, 15 were Saudi nationals. This detail alone turned global attention onto the kingdom, which until then had attracted little scrutiny in Western media outside of oil. Overnight, Saudi Arabia faced uncomfortable questions about how Islamist militancy had spread and what role the kingdom's religious, social, and educational systems played in fostering it. For the U.S., which had long enjoyed stable ties with Riyadh, the shock strained an alliance that had spanned decades. Criticism centered around the export of religious ideology from Saudi institutions across the world, where strict sermons and texts had often carried more influence than political speeches. Domestically, the kingdom soon experienced the consequences of extremist violence inside its own borders. While the government had maintained tight security for years, militant groups began to target sites within Saudi Arabia after the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003 heightened regional tensions. Bombings occurred in Riyadh that year, killing dozens and showing that the threat was not confined to distant conflicts. The Saudi state reacted with a wide-ranging crackdown, tracking networks of militants, arresting suspects across the country, and expanding a complex system of counterterrorism measures. By doing so, the monarchy sought to protect not only its own citizens, but also to prove to international partners that it was committed to tackling the same groups that had struck New York and Washington. At the same time, leaders understood that confronting militancy required more than military measures. The early 2000s saw the beginning of reforms designed to alter the image of the Saudi state, both internally and abroad. Municipal elections were introduced, limited in scope but significant compared with earlier years. Women, who had long been excluded from political or public participation, were given gradual expansions in rights. ranging from education access to eventual inclusion in local councils. These steps were cautious, but each signaled a shift away from rigid restrictions and attempted to demonstrate the kingdom's willingness to adapt. Education formed a major front of reform. For decades, Saudi schools had emphasized narrow religious curricula, which left graduates with limited skills for participation in a modern economy, and also reinforced a worldview critics linked to extremism. The government launched programs to broaden subjects, introduce science and foreign language training, and revise materials that were judged to encourage hostility. Alongside this, initiatives were created to send young Saudis abroad, exposing them to new perspectives and skills that could later contribute to development back home. The most ambitious of these was the King Abdullah Scholarship Program, which by the mid-2000s had sent hundreds of thousands of Saudis overseas, many studying for the first time in American, Canadian, British, or European universities. Despite the severe criticism that followed 9/11, Saudi Arabia did not drift away from its closest ally. Instead, it became a central participant in the U.S.-led war on terror. Security services from the kingdom provided intelligence, shared information about regional networks, and cooperated in ways that prevented attacks both in the region and overseas. This cooperation, often quiet and rarely publicized, demonstrated that American reliance on Saudi Arabia extended beyond oil. It was built equally upon shared security interests. For Riyadh, it meant preserving a relationship that guaranteed both political backing and protection in a region marked by conflicts. For Washington, it meant keeping one of the most influential Middle Eastern powers closely tied to its strategic vision for the post-9/11 world. In 2016, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman introduced a program known as Vision 2030, a roadmap designed to prepare Saudi Arabia for a future in which oil would no longer dominate the economy. For much of the 20th century, petroleum revenue had shaped almost every feature of Saudi life, but the reliance carried risks. Falling oil prices could cause sudden fiscal challenges, and the eventual decline in global demand raised long-term concerns. The plan, therefore, set out goals for diversifying income, building industries beyond energy, and reshaping society in ways that would support a modern workforce. One of its most ambitious projects is Neom, a proposed megacity planned on the Red Sea coast. What makes Neom remarkable is not only its projected scale, envisioned to cover an area 33 times the size of New York City, but also the futuristic concepts on which it is designed. Developers have promoted ideas such as car-free districts powered by renewable energy, artificial intelligence integrated into daily life, and entire neighborhoods built around advanced technologies rather than traditional infrastructure. While critics question the feasibility of these plans, the project captures the central theme of Vision 2030, moving far beyond existing models of urban development to showcase Saudi Arabia as a global leader in innovation. Alongside mega projects, investment has flowed into renewable energy and technological research. Solar and wind installations are planned for several regions, intended both to free domestic consumption from oil dependence and to establish expertise that can be exported abroad. The kingdom also identified tourism as a cornerstone for diversification. Historic sites across the peninsula are being restored. Visas have been expanded to international visitors, and coastal resorts are being built to attract travelers who in the past rarely considered Saudi Arabia as a destination. These steps reflect a broader trend of opening the country to the world, not only through business, but also through cultural exchange. Changes have also reached the social sphere. In recent years, restrictions that once defined Saudi daily life have been eased in visible ways. the long-standing ban on women driving was lifted, marking a shift in gender policies that had been in place for decades. Cinemas, absent since the early 1980s, reopened, allowing a new entertainment sector to emerge. Sports and live concerts, once rare, are now part of public cultural life. These reforms connect directly to Vision 2030's goal of creating an environment in which the economy is not only sustained by petroleum experts, but by a young, active population engaged in sectors such as tourism, technology, and services. Yet these reforms are not without obstacles. Balancing modernization with religious traditions remains an ongoing challenge for the monarchy. Some groups within the kingdom view the challenges with concern, raising debates that highlight the tension between rapid transformation and long-standing norms. Outside the country, scrutiny persists over human rights records and limits placed on political expression. These criticisms illustrate that modernization alone cannot erase international questions about governance and accountability. Still, the scale of Vision 2030 makes it one of the most far-reaching national strategies in the contemporary world. If it meets its objectives, the program could recast Saudi Arabia from an oil-dependent petrostate into an economy driven by innovation, renewable energy, and cultural industries. In that scenario, the phrase "oil kingdom" might give way to something entirely new, a state positioning itself as a leader in shaping post-oil futures, using wealth from the past to build a model for the decades ahead. The story of Saudi Arabia is more than the making of a kingdom. It is a reminder that even the harshest landscapes can carry deep histories that endure beyond shifting borders. If you enjoyed this journey through time, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more epic history told like never before.